Ladies and gentlemen, when someone begins to feel emotionally distant or withdrawn, it's easy to assume that it's a sign of disinterest or a lack of connection. However, the reality is often much more complex. There's a deep psychology at play when someone pulls away emotionally, and understanding this dynamic can help us navigate the subtleties of relationships in a healthier, more aware way. Often, when a person distances themselves, it's not because they feel less for you, but because they are experiencing an internal struggle they haven't yet understood or articulated. This emotional withdrawal is rooted in something deeper: self-worth and the way we perceive our own value in relation to others. In many cases, emotional withdrawal is not a conscious decision, but rather an unconscious defense mechanism. When a person starts to feel vulnerable, whether due to fear of rejection, fear of losing control, or fear of being hurt, they instinctively pull back. This withdrawal is not a rejection of you. It's a reflection of their own inner conflict. The brain, in its attempt to protect itself from perceived emotional danger, creates distance as a way to regain control. The issue lies not in the relationship, but in the person's internal perception of their own self-worth. They may not feel deserving of love or care at that moment, and thus they start to retreat, subconsciously trying to create space to protect themselves from potential emotional pain. This emotional withdrawal often comes when a person is struggling with their sense of self. If they feel overwhelmed by their own insecurities or doubts, they may feel they cannot fully open up or give themselves to someone else. The discomfort they feel in these moments doesn't stem from a lack of love or affection. Rather, it is a manifestation of their own fear that they are not enough, that their value or worth isn't solid enough to be fully present in the relationship. And in those moments of perceived inadequacy, they begin to pull away, thinking that distance might protect them from the possibility of rejection or failure. In the face of emotional withdrawal, it's essential to remember that this behavior often signals an inner struggle, not a lack of interest in you or the relationship. The person may simply be grappling with how they see themselves. The root of this withdrawal is not about you. It's about them coming to terms with their own sense of worth, their own fears, and the unresolved emotional patterns that drive their reaction. Understanding this allows us to approach the situation with greater compassion and patience, knowing that their emotional withdrawal is a signal, not of disconnection, but of inner work being done, even if it's being done in silence. When someone misses you the most, it's often when they are wrestling with their own emotional landscape, with their own understanding of who they are and what they deserve. It's in these moments, when they feel most disconnected, that they may need the most space to recalibrate and rediscover their sense of self-worth. They are in a process of realignment, trying to reconcile their internal world with the external reality of the relationship. And while it may feel distant or cold on the outside, it's important to recognize that beneath the surface, they are doing the work they need to do to become more aware of their own emotional needs and to learn how to better connect with their own sense of value. This is not the end of connection. It's merely a phase of personal growth, a temporary withdrawal to face the internal fears that must be overcome in order to deepen the connection with another. Recognizing this, we can approach emotional withdrawal not with frustration, but with understanding. It's a reminder that emotional distance doesn't always equate to emotional detachment. Sometimes it is merely the space someone needs to grow into a stronger, more confident version of themselves. And when they return from that space, they will do so with a clearer understanding of their own worth and their ability to share that with others in a more genuine, authentic way. Emotional withdrawal is often misunderstood as a sign of disinterest or a lack of affection, but in reality, it's a much deeper psychological process. It occurs when someone begins to retreat from emotional intimacy, often without fully understanding why. This withdrawal isn't a conscious choice, but rather a defensive mechanism triggered by inner conflicts, insecurities, or fears that the individual may not even be fully aware of. When someone starts to distance themselves emotionally, it typically stems from a place of vulnerability. The person may feel overwhelmed by the intensity of their emotions, or they may struggle to deal with the emotional intimacy that the relationship requires. In these moments, their mind, in an attempt to regain control, creates distance as a way to protect themselves from perceived emotional danger. This is the mind's way of shielding against the fear of being hurt, rejected, or misunderstood. It's important to understand that emotional withdrawal doesn't necessarily indicate a lack of care or love. Instead, it's a reflection of the person's inner state, their struggles with vulnerability, and their fear of not being enough. When they feel emotionally exposed, the instinct to pull away often arises. This retreat allows them to process their emotions and protect their sense of self-worth, even though it may create distance in the relationship. The problem is not necessarily in the relationship, but within the individual's internal world. They may be experiencing doubts about their value, questioning their ability to truly be loved, or struggling to reconcile their emotional needs with their sense of identity. This inner conflict, while not always obvious, can cause someone to withdraw to avoid feeling vulnerable or unworthy. They may feel like they need time and space to work through these feelings before they can re-engage emotionally. This withdrawal can also stem from fear. Fear of being seen as inadequate, fear of making themselves too available, or fear of emotional dependency. Often the person doesn't know how to articulate these feelings, and they may retreat simply because they are overwhelmed. What seems like emotional detachment on the surface is often a reflection of an internal struggle they aren't yet ready or able to face. When emotional withdrawal occurs, it's often a sign that the person is struggling with their self-worth. They may not consciously recognize it, but the way they pull away is a direct response to their feelings of inadequacy or fear of rejection. In these moments, the person may start to feel like they are not deserving of love, care, or attention. These feelings may not be rooted in anything you've done, but instead reflect their own internal insecurities. They may believe that they cannot fully open up or share their true self because they fear being judged or that their vulnerability will be met with rejection. The fear of not being enough is a powerful force. When someone feels disconnected from their sense of value, they instinctively begin to distance themselves from the source of emotional vulnerability, which in many cases is the relationship. This withdrawal is an unconscious way of protecting themselves from feeling exposed or unworthy. It's as if the mind convinces them that stepping back is a way to regain control of a situation where they fear they may lose themselves or their dignity. Instead of leaning into the connection, they pull away to avoid further emotional pain or disappointment. In these moments, the person may be unsure of how to express their fears or insecurities. They may not even recognize the root cause of their emotional withdrawal. It's not a sign that they no longer care or love you, but rather an internal battle within themselves. They are grappling with feelings of unworthiness that prevent them from fully engaging with the relationship. This internal conflict causes them to retreat emotionally, as their mind tries to protect them from further hurt. At the heart of this behavior is a deep-seated belief that they are not enough or that they will eventually be rejected for who they truly are. This belief, whether conscious or unconscious, becomes the driving force behind their emotional retreat. The person may need time to rebuild their self-worth, to heal from past emotional wounds, or to work through their fears. Only then can they return to the relationship with a clearer sense of their own value and a greater ability to connect on a deeper level. Emotional withdrawal is a deeply ingrained psychological defense mechanism that arises when someone feels emotionally vulnerable, insecure, or overwhelmed by their feelings. When someone retreats emotionally, it is often not a conscious decision but a subconscious attempt to protect themselves from emotional discomfort. This kind of withdrawal can occur when a person feels that their emotions are too intense or that they are not in control of their emotional state. Their instinct is to pull away to regain a sense of stability and to avoid feeling exposed or potentially hurt. It's a way of retreating to a place where they can process their feelings without the risk of vulnerability or judgment. This withdrawal is often linked to underlying fears, such as the fear of rejection or the fear of being misunderstood. When someone feels like they might not be able to meet the emotional expectations of a relationship, they may retreat to preserve their sense of self. They might fear that if they allow themselves to be fully seen, they will not be accepted for who they truly are. This fear of rejection often causes them to close off and distance themselves from the person they care about, even though they might not want to. In their mind, emotional distance feels safer than the possibility of emotional exposure. Additionally, emotional withdrawal can be an attempt to protect one's identity and sense of self-worth. When someone feels overwhelmed by their emotions, they may begin to question their own value, believing that they aren't deserving of the kind of love or attention they are receiving. They may feel that they will be judged, or that their vulnerability will be seen as a weakness. As a result, they unconsciously withdraw in an effort to maintain control over their own self-image and avoid the discomfort that comes with being fully open and authentic. This pattern of emotional withdrawal is often rooted in past experiences or deep-seated insecurities. It's not a sign of a lack of love or connection, but rather a manifestation of inner fears and struggles with self-worth. The person might feel that they need to distance themselves in order to process these emotions or come to terms with their own vulnerabilities. It's a protective mechanism that arises from the belief that being emotionally distant is safer than exposing their true feelings. The challenge is that in doing so, they may inadvertently push away the very connection they desire, as their emotional withdrawal creates a barrier between them and those they care about. Emotional withdrawal is often misunderstood as a simple act of detachment, but in reality, it is a complex psychological response tied to an individual's internal struggles. When a person starts to withdraw emotionally, it can be a sign that they are feeling overwhelmed by their emotions or are experiencing an inner conflict they haven't yet fully processed. This withdrawal is a way of creating space, not because they no longer care, but because they are trying to regain a sense of emotional control. It's a subconscious effort to protect themselves from further emotional exposure, often because they feel they are at risk of being hurt, rejected, or misunderstood. One of the most powerful triggers for emotional withdrawal is fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of not being enough, or fear of rejection can prompt someone to emotionally distance themselves from the relationship. When these fears are present, the person may feel that opening up or remaining emotionally available could lead to them being hurt or judged. Their mind may automatically respond by creating distance, both physically and emotionally, as a way of shielding themselves from the perceived risks of vulnerability. This withdrawal is a self-protective mechanism that emerges from a deep fear of emotional pain. What often gets overlooked is that this withdrawal is not necessarily a reflection of how they feel about the other person, but rather an indication of how they feel about themselves. They may be grappling with feelings of inadequacy or unworthiness, which makes it difficult for them to fully engage in the relationship. When they feel like they don't measure up, the instinct is to pull away to avoid exposing what they believe are their flaws or shortcomings. This act of retreat is, in a way, an attempt to maintain control over their sense of self-worth. The belief that they are not worthy of love or connection can become so overpowering that they begin to shut themselves off, even if they don't fully understand why. It is also essential to understand that emotional withdrawal is not a permanent state. It is often a temporary phase triggered by emotional overload or insecurity. The person who withdraws may eventually come to terms with their emotions and find the strength to reconnect, but only when they feel emotionally safe and secure enough to do so. This process requires introspection, self-compassion, and time to work through the internal fears and limiting beliefs that triggered the withdrawal in the first place. The key lies in recognizing that the emotional distance is a signal of deeper work being done, not necessarily a sign of disconnection or disengagement. Emotional withdrawal often stems from an underlying sense of self-doubt or fear of inadequacy. When someone begins to emotionally distance themselves, it is frequently a defense mechanism rooted in their internal struggles with self-worth. This withdrawal is not about rejecting the other person, but instead about retreating to a safer emotional space where they can try to regain a sense of control. It's an instinctive reaction to feelings of vulnerability that may feel overwhelming in the moment. The person may feel emotionally exposed, and in these moments, the instinct is to protect themselves from further hurt, even if that protection means creating distance in the relationship. At the core of emotional withdrawal is the fear that being emotionally open or available could lead to rejection, judgment, or emotional pain. This fear often originates from past experiences where vulnerability may have been met with disappointment or neglect. When these deep-seated fears are triggered, the individual may unconsciously pull away as a way of preventing themselves from facing the same emotional hurt again. Their mind equates emotional openness with risk, and they may feel that withdrawing is a safer alternative to feeling vulnerable. In these moments, they may not even realize that this is the root cause of their behavior. The fear of being unworthy or not enough is another powerful force behind emotional withdrawal. When someone is struggling with their own sense of value, it can be difficult for them to accept the love or care they are receiving. They may feel unworthy of it, believing that they don't measure up to the standards of the relationship or that they'll eventually be rejected once their true self is revealed. These feelings of inadequacy can lead to a subconscious desire to distance themselves emotionally. The person may feel that by pulling back, they are preserving their dignity and protecting themselves from the discomfort of feeling unworthy. Emotional withdrawal is not always about the other person. It's about the internal battles that the individual is facing. It is an expression of fear, self-doubt, and the struggle to reconcile one's internal emotional world with the external reality of the relationship. The person withdrawing may be experiencing a lack of confidence in their ability to fully engage with the relationship in a healthy way, so they instinctively step back to protect themselves. However, the withdrawal often creates a barrier that makes it difficult to truly address the core issues. Over time, the individual may need to confront these fears, rebuild their sense of self-worth, and work through the emotional pain that initially caused them to retreat. This emotional distance is, in essence, a temporary phase driven by fear and insecurity rather than a reflection of how they feel about the person they care for. Emotional withdrawal is a powerful coping mechanism that people use when they feel emotionally overwhelmed, insecure, or fearful of vulnerability. In these moments, an individual may distance themselves emotionally as a way to regain a sense of control. This response is not about the relationship itself, but more about the person's internal emotional state. When someone is struggling with self-worth or experiencing emotional turmoil, they may pull back because they do not feel capable of handling the emotional demands of the relationship at that moment. They may feel like they need to retreat in order to process their feelings and regain a sense of emotional balance. At the heart of emotional withdrawal is often a fear of being exposed or judged. When someone feels vulnerable, they might worry that they are not enough or that their flaws will be too much for the other person to accept. This fear can manifest as emotional distance, as the person feels they need to protect themselves from potential rejection or disappointment. In these moments, it's as though their mind tells them that pulling away is a way to shield themselves from further emotional harm, even though the withdrawal may unintentionally create a greater distance in the relationship. The instinct to protect oneself from vulnerability often leads to this emotional retreat, which can feel like a safer choice, despite the emotional cost. In addition to fear, emotional withdrawal is frequently tied to a person's struggle with self-worth. When an individual does not feel confident in their value, they may have difficulty accepting love or emotional support from others. They might feel undeserving or unworthy of care, and this belief can cause them to withdraw emotionally in an attempt to protect themselves from the discomfort of feeling inadequate. The withdrawal acts as a way to distance themselves from what they believe they cannot handle, the potential of emotional intimacy that challenges their sense of self-worth. This type of emotional retreat is often not a reflection of the other person's actions, but a signal that the individual is grappling with their own internal challenges. These may be deeply rooted fears or past emotional wounds that they are still processing. Rather than consciously pushing someone away, they may be retreating to protect their sense of identity and self-esteem. The emotional withdrawal serves as a temporary escape, a way to create space between their own insecurities and the emotional demands of the relationship. It's a defense mechanism that acts as a shield against feelings of vulnerability, and it often arises when someone feels they are not able to meet the emotional expectations placed on them. Emotional withdrawal can often be seen as a way to regain control when someone feels emotionally exposed or overwhelmed by their feelings. When a person retreats emotionally, it's usually because they are struggling with their internal world, not because they no longer care about the relationship. This act of withdrawal is often a subconscious response to an internal conflict or fear that the person is experiencing, which they may not be able to articulate or understand clearly. Their mind perceives emotional vulnerability as a risk, and their instinctive reaction is to pull away to avoid the possibility of emotional pain, rejection, or the feeling of being misunderstood. It's a way of protecting oneself from the discomfort that comes with emotional exposure. One of the core drivers of emotional withdrawal is the fear of vulnerability. Being vulnerable requires a level of openness and trust that many individuals may find difficult, especially if they have experienced emotional wounds in the past. If they fear that their vulnerability will be met with rejection, judgment, or indifference, they may choose to withdraw emotionally instead of confronting those fears. The person might feel that by creating distance, they can protect themselves from being hurt. They might also feel that they need to be in control of their emotions. An emotional withdrawal allows them to regain some sense of stability when their feelings seem too overwhelming or difficult to process. Additionally, emotional withdrawal is often linked to an individual's struggle with their self-worth. When someone feels insecure or inadequate, they may feel undeserving of love, affection, or emotional connection. They might believe that they are not worthy of the kind of attention or care that the other person is offering, and this belief can lead them to retreat emotionally. The withdrawal acts as a way to avoid confronting the painful belief that they are not enough. In moments of emotional uncertainty, the person may pull away to protect themselves from the emotional discomfort that comes from confronting their own perceived flaws or weaknesses. At its core, emotional withdrawal is a signal of deeper emotional work that the individual may need to process. It's not a sign of disinterest or disconnection, but a manifestation of the inner struggle they are experiencing. They may need time and space to work through their insecurities, fears, and doubts before they can re-engage emotionally in the relationship. It's a temporary response, often rooted in self-protection, and can be a sign that the person is working through their emotional boundaries and their own perceptions of self-worth. Emotional withdrawal often arises from a deep fear of being vulnerable or exposed. When someone begins to pull away emotionally, it is usually because they are struggling with their own insecurities or internal fears. They may feel overwhelmed by the emotional closeness of the relationship, which can trigger a subconscious need to distance themselves. This is not necessarily a reflection of how they feel about the person, but more a result of their own unresolved emotional conflicts. In these moments, their mind perceives vulnerability as a risk that could potentially lead to hurt or rejection, and thus they instinctively pull back in an attempt to protect themselves from perceived emotional danger. At its core, emotional withdrawal is a defense mechanism. It's a way of creating space between the individual and their fears. When someone feels emotionally exposed, they might become afraid of being judged, rejected, or abandoned. They may fear that their imperfections or flaws will be too much for the other person to accept, which triggers the desire to withdraw. This emotional retreat is not about the other person's actions. Rather, it's about the individual's struggle with their own emotional insecurities. By retreating, they feel like they can regain control of a situation that feels too overwhelming to navigate. They are trying to protect themselves from the discomfort of being vulnerable and exposed, even though the result is often an unintentional emotional distance in the relationship. This fear of being vulnerable is often rooted in past experiences or deep-seated beliefs about self-worth. If someone has been hurt before or has struggled with rejection in the past, they may carry these wounds with them into their present relationships. These past experiences can make it difficult for them to trust others fully, causing them to retreat when they begin to feel emotionally exposed. Additionally, if someone does not feel good enough or worthy of love, they may withdraw to avoid confronting these painful feelings. They might feel that pulling away is a way of protecting themselves from further emotional harm. Emotional withdrawal is often a temporary response to these fears and insecurities. It's a way for the individual to create space and distance in order to process their emotions, reflect on their fears, and regain a sense of control. Now, while this behavior can create distance in a relationship, it's not necessarily a sign of disinterest or lack of love. Rather, it is an indication that the person is working through their emotional challenges and may need time and understanding to heal before they can re-engage emotionally in a healthier way. Emotional withdrawal is often a reaction to the deep internal fear of vulnerability and emotional exposure. When someone begins to pull away, it is typically because they are feeling overwhelmed by their own emotional state or struggling with personal insecurities. The withdrawal is not a sign of a lack of care, but rather a protective instinct that arises when an individual feels that being emotionally available might expose them to potential hurt. This behavior is often subconscious, as the person may not fully understand why they are pulling away. Their mind instinctively shifts into a defense mode to protect them from feeling vulnerable or rejected. It is easier for them to retreat than to face the emotional risks that come with staying open and vulnerable. The fear of being judged, rejected, or misunderstood is one of the most powerful triggers for emotional withdrawal. When someone feels that their true self is not acceptable or that their vulnerabilities could lead to rejection, they may begin to distance themselves. In these moments, they may believe that pulling away will help them avoid further emotional pain or exposure. The mind convinces them that it's safer to close off emotionally than to remain open and risk being hurt. What they might not realize is that this withdrawal is more about protecting themselves from their own fears than about any lack of affection or interest in the relationship itself. It's their way of shielding their emotions from the possibility of further distress, even though it may unintentionally create distance between them and the person they care about. In addition to fear, emotional withdrawal can also stem from a lack of self-worth or a deep sense of inadequacy. When someone does not feel good enough or worthy of love, they may feel unworthy of emotional connection or care. These feelings of inadequacy can lead to the subconscious belief that they are undeserving of the relationship or the love they are receiving. As a result, they may retreat emotionally to avoid the discomfort of confronting these feelings. The withdrawal acts as a protective shield, allowing them to avoid the emotional intensity that comes with accepting their own vulnerabilities and the love that might challenge their self-perception. Ultimately, emotional withdrawal is not an indication of a lack of love, but a sign that the individual is struggling internally. It is an emotional response to the fear of vulnerability and the internal battle with self-worth. This behavior is often temporary, and with time, the person may work through their fears and insecurities, allowing them to return to the relationship with a renewed ability to connect emotionally. Emotional withdrawal can often be a sign of deeper internal struggles that the individual is facing. When someone withdraws emotionally, it's typically not because they no longer care about the relationship, but because they are grappling with their own fears and insecurities. This behavior is often a way of coping with overwhelming emotions, as the person might feel that they cannot handle the vulnerability or the emotional intimacy the relationship requires. The instinct to pull away arises from the belief that by creating emotional distance, they can shield themselves from the potential emotional risks that vulnerability brings. It is a subconscious attempt to regain control of a situation that feels too emotionally intense. One of the primary drivers of emotional withdrawal is the fear of emotional exposure. When someone is emotionally vulnerable, they may feel exposed, which can trigger deep-seated fears of being rejected, judged, or not being enough. These fears are often rooted in past experiences of emotional hurt or rejection, which create a sense of emotional insecurity. As a result, when they feel emotionally vulnerable in the present, they instinctively pull away to protect themselves from experiencing similar pain again. Their mind convinces them that it's safer to withdraw than to stay open and risk being hurt. However, this retreat often results in emotional distance and can inadvertently cause more tension in the relationship. In addition to fear, emotional withdrawal is frequently tied to struggles with self-worth. When an individual feels inadequate or unworthy of love, they may find it difficult to fully engage with the relationship. The belief that they are not deserving of emotional intimacy can drive them to withdraw, even when they care deeply for the other person. This withdrawal is not about rejecting the partner, but about protecting themselves from the discomfort of confronting their own perceived flaws or vulnerabilities. They may feel that by stepping back, they are safeguarding their sense of identity and emotional well-being, even if it means pushing the other person away in the process. Emotional withdrawal, while painful, is often a temporary phase in the individual's emotional journey. It is a response to unresolved fears and emotional wounds that need time and space to heal. The person may need to work through their internal struggles with self-worth, vulnerability, and trust before they can return to the relationship in a more emotionally available way. The withdrawal is a reflection of the inner work being done, not a reflection of the depth of affection they feel for the other person.